Our final presentation today is Sustainable Investing in Practice by Tom Gosling.
Yeah, thanks very much. GCGC has staying power. I'm impressed. I honestly thought it was going to be me, Ernest, and Pedro having a little discussion up here. I think it must have leaked that Elaine has booked Robbie Williams for the drinks reception. Us having heard what great shape the finances of ECGI are in from Marco earlier. This is a paper by two leading academics and a practitioner, and this conference drew the short straw and you got the practitioner, but I'm going to do my best to represent the academic side of this also. This is a survey paper where we surveyed active equity portfolio managers drawn from mutual fund managers listed on Morningstar, and we got a response from just over 500 of them. 290 of which were traditional investors, 219 sustainable investors. What this means is that a sustainable investor is the portfolio manager of a fund that is marketed in some way as having sustainability characteristics, and a traditional investor is everybody else. A little under half of them were US funds, mostly others marketed in the EU and UK. Importantly, this is just focused on asset managers, and we may come on to talk about kind of the implications for asset owners, but this is a survey of asset managers. And we purposefully directly contacted the portfolio managers because we did not want ESG people or central people. We wanted the people who are actually managing the money, because what we're really interested in here is how do portfolio managers think about ES performance, so environmental and social performance, note not ESG performance, ES performance, in how they act, in how they, what their beliefs are, their objectives, their constraints, how it feeds into stock selection, voting and engagement. Why a survey? I mean, we can do a lot with empirical research in terms of observing the ESG characteristics of funds, how they change, how portfolio managers are trading, but we can't observe always why they're doing that, right? There are multiple potential motivations which could relate to constraints that they face from fund mandates. It could be reputational concerns, it could be their beliefs about alpha or risk management, or it could be non-pecuniary preferences. And one of the ways I think about survey papers, having done a couple of them now, is that I think they're a great way of potentially shining a light on an area and raising new research questions that maybe need to be studied in more detail. So we start off, I'm just going to pull out a few snippets from the paper. I won't be able to go through all the results. But we start off by trying to get at the beliefs of these portfolio managers about environmental and social performance, and we ask them to rank a series of factors in terms of its importance for the long-term value of companies that they look at in their investment universe. And we include in here some things that are manifestly somewhat important, like strategy and competitive position. Also some things that are manifestly not that important. I mean, in a Mogliano-Miller world, capital structure doesn't matter at all, although of course it does matter with frictions. But also we separate out governance from E&S very explicitly here to see what differences there are. And a few notable things. I mean, the first is that ES performance is ranked comfortably lowest by both traditional and sustainable fund managers. And I should disclose here that we got lots of complaints in the free text fields where people say, you can't separate these things, everything's interconnected, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But despite that, very consistently across all kind of subpopulations, people still manage to rank it last without any difficulty. The other thing that's sort of interesting as well here is that governance is very, very much higher than ES, and we often kind of lump ESG together when we analyse sort of sustainable investing, but clearly it's something that has much wider support. Now, despite the fact that ES is relatively not viewed as that important, that doesn't mean that it's completely unimportant in absolute terms. So we also asked about the materiality of ES, and 85% of investors, including nearly 80% of the traditional investors, do consider at least one ES issue to be material or highly material within the kind of universe of companies in which they normally invest. Although it should be said that the factors that are viewed as most material are typically those that most directly internalise within the company. So employee well-being, customer welfare and safety, and then pollution, where obviously you've got kind of regulatory issues and constraints, and carbon emissions, where again you have the potential for carbon pricing. Issues such as ecological impacts, diversity, inclusion, rank very, very low from a materiality perspective. The other thing we asked actually was, to what extent do you think the kind of universe of companies in which you invest broadly invest in ES to the right amount to maximise shareholder value. And interestingly, amongst both sustainable investors and traditional investors, the broad conclusion is that companies are investing about right in this stuff, or if anything, they're slightly over-investing. In particular, there was a view on GHG, greenhouse gas emissions, that there was over-investment in reducing emissions compared with what would be optimal from a shareholder value perspective for both traditional and sustainable investors. And I'll come back to some of the implications of that later. There is, perhaps surprisingly, for academics who know that there's a wealth of academic research that suggests there's no kind of great or very robust relationship between ES performance and risk-adjusted total shareholder return, there is actually a reasonable body of belief amongst both traditional and sustainable investors that there is. So a majority of, a large majority of sustainable investors and a plurality of traditional investors do believe that companies that have good ES performance do tend to outperform. Although there is also quite a lot of heterogeneity because nearly half of traditional investors, nearly a quarter of sustainable investors do not, over a quarter of sustainable investors do not believe in ES alpha, and actually whilst a significant proportion of traditional investors do. So there's not a neat mapping, which is something that comes out in various parts of the survey. Why do they believe that ES performers typically outperform in TSR terms? There is some support for the idea that ES is a material factor that's underpriced by the market. There is some support that ES companies attract fund flows that will drive their prices up over time. But overwhelmingly, the most popular answer was that good ES performance is correlated with other characteristics that drive long-term outperformance. So it's not the improvement in ES performance itself that is driving the outperformance. It's the kind of comment was, well-run companies will have good ES performance. Bad ES performance is a signifier of a badly run company. And that also shows itself up in the converse of this outperformance question, which is where we asked, do we expect bad ES performance to outperform or underperform in the long term? And here there's quite a consistent view amongst traditional and sustainable investors that bad ES performers will tend to underperform. And actually the view of bad ES performance being a downside risk indicator comes out in a number of places in the survey. What about objectives? I'll look at kind of one take on objectives. I mean, I guess in short order, the overwhelming finding of the survey was the objective of portfolio managers were overwhelmingly financial, right? And now this is not a surprise to anybody who's lived in and around the portfolio management industry, but these people are not generally in the business of trading off financial returns for ES performance, right? It's kind of not their job. So what we find is that when we ask them how much long-term risk-adjusted TSR would you tolerate a company sacrificing to improve its ES performance, a little over a quarter say that they would allow a small sacrifice, but most of these are in the kind of realms of 1 to 10 basis points a year, which is pretty kind of trivial. And actually, when you dig into some of the free text comments that some of these people kind of gave, they sort of kind of hedged it a little bit and said, of course, I mean, only if it kind of comes good in the long term. So they hadn't really read the question properly. But, most people are saying, a lot of people are saying, zero, we won't tolerate any sacrifice. Or, interestingly, that there is no sacrifice necessary because there is no trade-off. Now, that's kind of bonkers, obviously, and I'll come back to that if I have time at the end, right? The idea that, anyway. Now, what were the sort of views here? I'm a fiduciary, we're fiduciaries, we have a fiduciary duty, it's my fiduciary duty, fiduciary duty, fiduciary duty, fiduciary duty. In fact, some people were saying, this is a really stupid question. Clearly we can't sacrifice returns because it's not our job, right? What about constraints? Okay, so if portfolio managers are not voluntarily trading off ES performance against financial returns, can they be made to do so through constraints? And the answer to that is, again, broadly, yes. So we said, have any of these factors, so firm-wide ES policies, fund mandate, client wishes, or concern for reputation or sustainability rating, ever caused you to do any of these kind of actions? And we dig into this a little bit in subsequent questions. But we see that a significant, almost all sustainable investors and a significant majority of traditional investors have taken some of these actions more than they otherwise would have done because of one of these constraints that they were placed under by these kind of policy or mandate or client relationship issues. Perhaps unsurprisingly, for sustainable investors, it's the mandates. It's the kind of avoiding stocks that's the most significant because, quite a lot of mandates imply, in effect, exclusions of one form or another. But also, kind of interestingly, some of these sort of constraints seem to be working against the ES objectives that these funds might have had. So, for example, for a third of sustainable investors, they were prevented by these constraints from owning ES laggards whose ES performance we could have improved, or it was causing them to focus on visible dimensions of ES performance at the expense of more important ES issues. So it does seem that, for a minority of investors, these constraints were actually leading to kind of counterproductive outcomes in terms of the ES performance or improvements in the real world that were being delivered. So which of these four factors, the policies, mandate, client wishes, or concern for reputation, actually ended up being most important? No surprise that for sustainable investors, it's the fund mandates are the most important. I mean, clearly, that is, in a way, what defines a sustainable fund is the commitment and constraints that are placed within the fund mandate. But firm-wide policies are also very important. And it was sort of interesting, really, to us, that firm-wide policies were also very important for traditional investors as well. So an example here might be a fund that is not marketed as traditional as sustainable in any way, shape, or form, but which is part of a fund family where they might have an overall firm-wide policy in relation to, for example, voting for minimum levels of diversity on firm boards, or they might have a kind of net zero kind of portfolio commitment. And so, nearly a third of traditional investors were reporting constraints from firm-wide policies, despite themselves not having any direct mandate constraints. And these constraints could have an impact on returns, particularly for sustainable investors, where for 38% they reported a negative impact on returns. And of those that said it was impossible to quantify, if you look at the free text comments, most of these are saying, look, we think it's kind of negative in expectation, but we can't really put a finger on a number. But the others were actually making some kind of broad attempt to quantify the impact. So these constraints bite. The hard constraints are around twice as likely for sustainable funds as for traditional funds, which isn't hugely surprising. But we also have this quite high rate of potential return penalties for sustainable funds. But importantly, these are not given up voluntarily. These are imposed by the constraints and the mandates. How does this actually translate into actions? And we look at stock selection, voting, and engagement. I'm just going to talk about the findings for stock selection. So we ask whether the portfolio manager's underweight or overweight poor or good ES performance for any of the following reasons. Okay, and there's a score from kind of 0, never, to 4, very often. And what I'm showing on this table is the mean score. So 2 would be the sort of somewhat often, the midpoint. And then we also show the percentage that gave often or very often. So again, no massive surprise that for sustainable funds, it's the constraints that drive the portfolio selection the most, although the prevalence is still quite high, even for the traditional funds. But interestingly, for both financial and sustainable funds, the second most common reason is financial considerations. Okay, and so if you look at kind of people who choose any of these, so 51% of traditional and 76% of sustainable PMs often over or underweight stocks based on ES for at least one of these financial reasons. So the sort of the dirty secret in all of this kind of like hoo-ha around ESG and all of these terrible sustainable funds that are doing all this naughty ESG stuff, I don't believe I can have 0 minutes when I started at nearly 4:15. Sorry? 08. You started at 4:08. Did I? Okay, all right. So it doesn't... right, okay. All right, well, I better stop then. Right, I will take another... I am nearly at the end here. So what's interesting is that despite all of this hoo-ha around these terrible sustainable funds that are doing all of this ES stuff, actually traditional funds are doing it as well. But guess what? They're mainly doing it for financial reasons because actually, in some cases, this stuff matters. And so there's a lot of ES activity going on around stock selection. But very little going on around attempted impact. So the lowest results came for rewarding companies for improving ES performance through under or overweighting them, or trying to affect companies' costs of capital. So the key takeaways here, the financial objective dominates. ES performance is, by far not the most material factor that portfolio managers are looking at, but it's not completely unimportant. But I think this does mean that, perhaps obviously, asset managers are unlikely to lead the charge on improving ES performance in the companies they invest in. Constraints matter, interestingly, for traditional as well as sustainable funds, probably to a greater degree than we thought would be the case, mainly but not only through firm-wide policies. Beliefs on whether ES drives alpha are quite varied across portfolio managers, and they do drive stock selection decisions. So that prevalence of investors that was using ES considerations to under or overweight stocks was associated with a belief on whether ES was associated with outperformance. And these constraints and beliefs don't split neatly between fund types. So this idea, quite a lot of academic research looks at sustainable funds, non-sustainable funds, but actually what we find is that the constraints and beliefs don't really split that neatly in that way. There's quite a lot of heterogeneity. And, and actually in aggregate, traditional and sustainable funds are not so different, actually. I mean, there are differences in tendency, but they're not the completely different class of funds that might sometimes be thought. And so I think the underlying constraints and beliefs of the portfolio manager perhaps matter more than the labels. And just a couple of thoughts for future research areas. I mean, given what we've found, there's probably a need for more consideration of what sustainable investing models look like under delegated portfolio management. So we often think about a sustainable portfolio investor having a joint utility function where they have pecuniary and non-pecuniary objectives. Actually, when that's being implemented through a delegated fund management model, what does that mean for how optimal the outcomes are? But also sustainable investing models, which are often based on heterogeneous preferences around sustainability. It's also important to recognise that there are heterogeneous beliefs. So that's it. And now over to the discussion.
So over to you, Pedro.
Thank you. I echo Tom's commitment of everyone staying in this room and the ground this long. But I think you are in for a treat. This is, survey research is not easy to do, and it's quite an achievement, I think the authors did, to illuminate what were beliefs, objectives, constraints, and actions. So I'm a bit polluted. I think I was a big proponent of this paper, particularly when we decided to award this paper the best PI award paper last year, because I think it is important to ask the portfolio managers and so forth. So you are not going to rerun this because this is a survey paper. So there's, my role here is not to do what should you have done differently. But I would just say that learning from this, what would we then do next? So what I learned from this is from the express perspectives of ES is immaterial, but constraints matter. So there's some, maybe you asked these people and they said, we're doing what we were told to do, and sort of not greenwashing as perhaps found in by other research approaches. But the question might be posed then, what are you constrained to do? What is the alignment you might have with your clients? And so maybe the next survey should be, what do asset owners think about this? However, I'll just point a couple things of, acknowledging the limitations of this survey. The first is institutional investing is a big world, and we're constraining ourselves just by looking at ESG equity mutual funds, open-ended mutual funds, the Morningstar universe. That is a relatively small share to begin with, particularly on the sustainable side of things. So if you look at ESG labeled funds, that'd be like 3 trillion AUM and if you added up global capital markets around the time of the survey, equity plus fixed income, that's 230 trillion. So that's, sampling that small part, if you like. There are other, definitions of sustainable investing. If you take GSIA or Sustainable Investment Forum, that encompasses other investment managers beyond mutual funds, so insurer, pension funds, etc. And if you take the PRI, which was the entity that ultimately awarded you the prize, they would, as we heard before in this conference, there might be 100 plus a trillion signatories. So the question is the generalizability. That's what I'm trying to say here. If we go beyond pooled investment vehicles, right, where which is the focus here, and go into other investment managers, or if we go a step further into the asset owners themselves, what would we have learned? So that's maybe one opportunity. The second opportunity, and they deal with this, is they on purpose focus on active managers. So, and the portfolio selection is their main focus, but there are other, ways, voting and engagement, which would be interesting to compare and contrast what do passive managers believe. And what if you go beyond, secondary shares and more focus on primary markets or other investment vehicles beyond equities as well? That would also be interesting. What if you go with, beyond the portfolio managers into the other team members that actually more engage with stewardship? And so you're basically getting me to say, do a few more surveys. Let's get this fleshed out, and that more. The other thing you learn from a survey is might be a point in time pulse, a temperature on an issue. So ESG, you can't really read there. 2021 was the year of ESG. 22 was like maybe, ESG is everything and nothing. And so we may be breaking this apart. 23, we're into high inflation, America's cultural wars. 24 is everything, everyone starts pulling out. And so that's where we took the temperature. So at this time, maybe it's already that everyone has become a sustainable investor, or maybe everyone's like, well, we're in a sort of crisis mode here, so let me figure out what I should answer to this survey. Of course, this has evolved to, some claims that ESG is that. So what I would say is take a survey every year. Of course, it's expensive and hard to achieve that, but it would be nice to see the evolution. And if you can raise the money at the LSC to do that every year, I highly recommend, pursuing that so you can, keep doing this, taking a temperature. So take a temperature of others plus every year, right? Very easy to say. All right, so on the specifics of the survey, the first question is just, I would still, and this is something you could do, is just tell me more about the demographics of this, the ones that answer versus the Morningstar universe. You do have comparisons between the traditional and non-sustainable, but it would be nice to know. Generally, Ernest, am I off or still good to go? Okay. The next is you have one definition of materiality, of inside-out materiality, which you force, but that doesn't mean people read what you tell them to read. And as you said, and you acknowledge that, but that's always an issue. The last thing is you, gave them anonymity. They still might feel like they should answer what they ought to believe rather than not. And so, and I know you can't not link it to holdings, but it would have been nice to finally see what did they answer in the survey versus what did they actually do in their portfolios. That would be interesting as well. Okay, Ernest, give me 1 minute if I, 4 more minutes, okay. So now I'm going to talk about the specifics of what was found in the paper that was very interesting. First result that I think you should all learn, so if you haven't caught up with Tom's an amazing presenter, but if you feel like I need to digest this again, go read this again, because every time I read, I learn something. The first is, as they ranked factors, ES ranks bottom. That's the first result they had. And they conclude, that it's non-material in a relative sense to the other factors. But it's very hard to really tease this apart, as Tom said. For many people, culture could be part of, like how you treat your employees and so forth. So all these things could be And then ES and G are difficult to separate at times. The other thing is there's some like double personality or like inconsistency with, in answers, in that, yes, it's not material in that sense, but then they're expecting some alpha from this. So the question is, maybe they're confused on materiality, or maybe the market is confused about materiality. Of course, you cannot rerun the survey, but one thing I would do perhaps is, because one is reporting averages, is are these the same people, or are they different respondents? So if you took within respondents consistency across or not, this is something you could still perhaps do. And lastly, their views of whether portfolio companies are investing optimally or not. So this is going to be my main comment, because I think given the, it's been served the survey, then we can still take the answers and learn from, individually as each respondent, how are they internally consistent, what view of the world is coming across from all those. The second big block is objectives and trade-offs and constraints. As you said, fiduciary duty shows up. A lot of the lawyers in the room are much more qualified than I am on this, but I would assume, Dan, looking at you and others, this fiduciary duty could be interpreted differently around the world. And you do have a cross-section of this. So maybe there was a chance of like how big of this was as an answer, depending on the geography. That would be nice to learn. And on the constraints as well, you said a lot of this goes back to the fund mandates and to the firm-wide policies. The zero came off again. So I'll try to respect the chair here. But, sorry. So it would just be nice if there was some mapping to what was true for the mandates or the firm-wide policies. So learning more from there. If there's some mapping, I know the anonymity, so maybe you can't get to it fully, but. And then finally on actions, again, yeah, lots to do there. I would just say maybe that would be more appropriate for the next survey, given you have voting and engagement there. Last call is just, we are very open to research like this that challenges. And Connor was here, so I'm very appreciative that you were also able to bring him here. And just let's be honest and fact-based as we pursue these topics. So the survey approach is clearly a good approach. There are many other approaches from archival data, but I would just echo that we should having these conversations and not, be siloed. And so I encourage you to, if you have a chance, join us in Brazil for the next one in the fall, or join us online. And again, commend the paper, and thanks everyone for being such. I learned a ton from this conference. Thank you, Marco, Elaine, and Suzanne for all the logistics, and Catherine as well. All right, cheers, everyone.
As we are running short of time, Tom, would you mind if we start to take questions? Yeah, John, Eric.
Fascinating paper, great job. I note that 40% of your respondents say that their fund, in the sustainable fund category, say that there's no fund mandate to invest sustainably. That raises an interesting question about perhaps a mismatch between the way you're defining a sustainable fund and the way people conceive of themselves as being sustainable or not. In other words, if you don't have a fund mandate to be sustainable, are you a sustainable fund?
Sorry, should we take a... Do you want to take a group of questions, or?
Yes, I think the next one would be Eric.
Yep.
So Tom, really interesting study, and I'm going to withhold the urge to ask you to go out and do more surveys.
Yeah, the
But
question you should have asked
there
was.
is
yeah.
stuff that you can do, it seems to me. So one of the things that you might be able to do is try just randomly sample your non-responders just to make sure that there's nothing weird about that. But that may be too late. You could sort of ask whether some of these folks are sort of riding the tide of whatever the current moment is, and they've actually changed that designation from what John has asked you about, right? Are they, if you track them down today, are they still sustainable or traditional? The one thing I'm also kind of interested in is whether you could take these responses and instead of believing them, try to do some type of predictive statistical arbitrage, because now we got a couple of years, right, of returns from these companies on the basis of the survey responses, even non-responses, and you could probably employ any number of explainable AI, random forest, penalized regression, Shapley value, whatever, to try to get a sense of like what of these responses was actually predictive of being able to get some sort of alpha related to sustainability.
Right, thank you.
Hi, Tom. I have a couple of comments, not enough time to get into all of them, but one is it would be great for there to be, and again, I haven't read the paper, but it'd be good if there are many people in this room who've written around the conflicts of interest of asset managers, and I think getting into that literature will be really important here because it's kind of behind some of, I think there's some explanatory power there for some of your results, including things like how they were perceiving the question about the long term. So that's one thing. And then the other is just a formal request in front of witnesses for a second paper, second survey on the bond side, because this kind of plays into the homunculus of literature on ESG. So it's a lot of public equity focus, which is where there's so much activity and literature, but actually basically negligible impact, or so it'd be great to see if you do this on the bond side, and there could be a fun little extra paper there because you could actually test how far that downside risk concern goes, because you could see how far, if that extends to the point of default risk in the minds of these investors.
Should I take those three or?
Okay.
Oh, right, okay.
So,
we're going to find, wow, this is going to
one
test
question,
my memory. Yeah.
One question and one comment. The
Yeah.
question is, it's not obvious how to define the mandate and also changes in the mandate. So it would be very useful to clarify what you do to interpret the result. And the comment is that is the following. You seemed to interpret the fact that more sustainable funds were saying that that were investing more in sustainable stocks as evidence that they would renounce to performance, but it's not obvious because they could have better technology. And finally, in my GFE paper with Nick Ganchev and Raquel Lee, we have a very complementary result using archival data and a natural experiment due to the change in trading behavior by non-sustainable funds due to the globe ratings. And we find a trade-off between sustainability and performance. And we find no difference for the ESG funds that were designated as such through the prospect.
Thank you. Okay, great.
Fantastic survey. I was a little bit puzzled that you're separating G, but you're not separating E and S. The reason why I'm asking is some of your results that make ordinary and sustainable funds look pretty much alike can be driven by the fact that E can be interpreted as a risk factor, which of course matters for financially motivated asset managers. And therefore, you might see a similar weighting in the relevance of these factors, but a sustainable fund and a financially motivated asset manager might mean different things through that. And therefore, it could be interesting to see. I don't know if you can do it right now by looking at the funds, what they really understand under their ESG sustainable orientation. But I think that would be interesting, what's driving your similarity in the two fund categories, whether that's really ES or whether it's rather E, because I would probably suspect the latter.
Okay, thank you. Some of the things that people would like us to do would rely on us actually knowing the specific fund that is being referenced here. For anonymity reasons, we didn't capture the fund that this individual relates to. So some of the analyses that you'd love to be able to do, you can't do. I do agree that there's still stuff we can do within kind of the kind of the structure of the data within the survey itself, but we don't have that ability to link to external archival data. How are we defining mandate, and what is a sustainable fund? I mean, linking these two things together. I mean, here, in terms of the categorization of the survey, sustainable fund is just something where the respondent has said that the fund is marketed as sustainable in some way, right? Now, what does that actually mean in practice, right? It means that, that marketing as sustainable will presumably impose some constraints on that fund around what it can do. And indeed, for 85% of those sustainable funds, they reported that there were tangible constraints in the investment decisions that they had made. I mean, I think if you look at it, separately, archivally, you can see that actually, most commonly, those sustainable mandates involve aspects of exclusions. Right? I mean, that is the most common single reason. There are other factors that can go into sustainable mandates, but normally it is restricting the investment universe, and that's why the most common consequence of the constraint for the sustainable funds was, missing out on stocks that they thought were going to outperform, or missing out on portfolio diversification. So I don't know if that also answers your question about the mandate, because we're not looking at this. We don't get the specifics of the fund mandate, so we ask them, is it a sustainable mandate or not, i.e. are there sustainable constraints? And then we ask them to report on the constraints that they experience as a result of the mandate. Asset owners, we definitely plan to do a follow-up with asset owners. That's in progress. I mean, we wanted to get a very well-defined population where we kind of knew who they were and how you could access them, and get a really clear result on that. But absolutely understand that, I mean, the asset owner thing is a really important side of the equation. I like the idea of looking at the bond side as well. That could perhaps be done in a more focused way, but particularly given the very consistent result that came out of this, which is that ES is viewed as a downside risk factor. That was one of the things that was actually really quite consistent across a number of aspects of the survey. I can't read my own comment there, I'm afraid. So perhaps we'll end.
Okay. So we got to the end of these two excellent days of presentations and engaging discussions. It was a pleasure to host the GCGC, I always get it wrong, at Imperial College. I hope you found it enriching, and that living London, you will have a lot of food for thought for new research projects. Just like to highlight a few things that were discussed. We talked about geopolitics, the new challenges, right? So ESG, a lot of new insights. We talked about mindful snacking. So I thought that was very interesting. And well, as you know, this would not have been possible without the work of a really dream team. I would like to thank especially Elaine, Suzanne, Okay, you'll have to come and get it. Okay, I need to make sure I don't forget anyone. This is just like the Oscar winners. I'm always surprised that they manage to memorize the whole script, but then when it comes to thanking people, they need their little paper, and so am I. Okay, so special thank as well to Catherine, locally to, thank you. Locally to Anna Wilhelm and to Maura Ranking, who's not today, but was very helpful as well. Also the technical team as well. To all of the presenters, all of the discussants, all of the scientific committee. So thank you so much. Panel members, we shouldn't forget the panel members. And of course, Marco. Without his initiative, this wouldn't be possible at all. Well, and that's it. All good things come to an end. And the good news is, I know. Wait. Let me do my thing. So all good things come to an end. Good news is, next year, we'll have it again in Singapore, right? And hopefully, we'll manage to keep up the ratio of what? Of jokes to words, right? We'll manage to keep that. And now I'll hand it over to Jin Lee.
I'm here, so I'll just stay here.
Okay.
Well, I do have a small, list here, but I thought the first one that we haven't thanked is Claudia for organizing the 2 days. Wonderful experience for us. And also, I think we should thank the conference committee for putting together a great program, and particularly to Martin Schmelz and Holger Spemann, who screened many of the papers before the committee got involved. So thank you. And Claudia already thanked most of the very instrumental team who put it together, including Anna, including Catherine, Suzanne, and Elaine, and also the photography, video, catering, and events teams. So probably they deserve a big round of applause also. And we should thank Provost Ian Wellesley for opening the conference for us, even though he's not here now. Yeah. And then the presenters, discussants, panelists, moderators, and session chairs. I think we should also, again, give them a big round of applause. Thank you. And the prize winners, congratulations. The editors, the sponsors of the ECGI Working Paper Series. And also, I think we should not forget there's also non-academic partner for GCGC in addition to all the partner universities. So we have the representative from JPX this year, Kodai Yokoyama. Thank you. And also to the GCGC board members. And also our vice chairs, Eric Leitman and Jennifer. Who's here, yes. I think we should also give a special thanks to the individuals who founded GCGC more than 10 years ago, especially those who have since passed on the baton to new GCGC board members, but have joined us this weekend. This would include Colin Mayer, Julian Franks, Mike Barhart, Lulu Lan, and Kang Sik Kim. Thank you. And to those who couldn't make it this time, but hopefully would join us next year in Singapore. Ron Gilson, Henry Hansmann, Hideki Kanda, and Uwe Walls. Thanks them. And as Claudia just mentioned, next year the GCGC will move to NUS in Singapore. It's already on the screen there. And Umakan Varolti, who's here, would be the conference chair next year. We greatly look forward. We greatly look forward to the conference, and the call for papers will be issued over the summer. Last but certainly not least, don't forget that we're going to please join us directly across the street at 58 Princess Gate to toast a glass to this great conference and to the team at Imperial for hosting us. Thank you.